Good morning. I have no idea, because I couldn't hear back there, whether Elizabeth... Oh, that's who I am, in case she didn't say hello. Nice to see you all here. So I want to just talk a little bit about some of the general global issues that we'll try to narrow down and focus on in New York when we move to the panel. In the context of a series I've been working on for the Times on cities and climate change, I was remembering this morning that some years ago I went to Colombia, the country, not the university, and I met a former president there, and asked him what had happened to the Transmilenio, which, as many of you know, is the rapid bus system in Bogota that had been so successful. And when I was in Bogota, it was a calamity. The system was collapsing. It had the exact opposite effect politically that we outsiders thought, which was that people were incredibly angry at all those, including Enrique Peñalosa at the time, who had inaugurated the program because the system was working so badly. And this guy said to me, well, you know, here in Latin America, we have this idea that nobody wants to raise the children of their lovers, the former children of their new lover. And I thought, meaning, of course, that political regimes, when they come in, don't want to sustain the work that previous regimes had undertaken, their rivals had undertaken. I thought at the time, thank God I come from a country that doesn't have such chauvinistic, petty... that was a long time ago now. And, you know, after that, that was right around the time that New York's grid had its centenary. And, you know, think about that now. A project undertaken in, 1811, right? Which took decades to complete, which means, of course, that it was a project that had to last through not just many administrations, but many generations, and took a commitment to an idea about what would make the city great, and an investment that was larger than ourselves. So we now confront these incredibly huge problems. I would say that water is the largest issue in the world now. One could say that in an era of urban migration when you have so many people, 65 million or more people, migrants around the world, many of them displaced by rural desertification and political conflict that's spurred by things related to climate change. Water is in many ways the source of a lot of these problems, and at the heart of the water problems are climate problems. Those, you know, think about it, there are more than 1 billion people in the world, most of them women, who have to carry drinking water every day from some source, at least a mile, walk with drinking water for their families. This is just an unbelievable problem, but possibly solvable in ways that are not enormous. And then water, of course, relates to climate in all of our cities. We're either overwhelmed by it, as we've seen from Puerto Rico to Houston to here, of course, with Sandy, or we live with poor access to it. So I began this series that I was doing in Mexico City, a series on climate, because I thought, you know, look, here's a city that's a mile high in the mountains, nowhere near a coast, but it's a good illustration of the ways climate change really, the Pentagon calls it a threat multiplier, and by that it means that it sort of identifies and exploits weaknesses of our society, political weaknesses, economic and social ones. So you have Mexico City, a city that was in 1950 something like 30 square miles. It's now 3,000 square miles, and much of that has to do with informal development. An exploded city and built on lakes. When the Aztecs were there in the early 14th century, they lived with the lakes, they lived with the water. They created what were called chinampas that were essentially floating gardens that fed them, and they had a system of canals. The Spanish came in, had no idea what it was like to live with water. They didn't recognize this sort of typology, and so drained the lakes, cleared the forests. They turned canals into streets, and they had floods that lasted, 5 years. The city now is sinking, among other problems, because they've had to drain water from the aquifers underneath the city, and also draw about 40% of their water from far away and pump it a mile high at a spectacular engineering achievement, which is also unbelievably costly, and that is nonetheless still at a cost of 40% of the water being lost in pipes along the way, and that still leaves many people in the city without access to drinking water from the tap, about 20%, and that's a conservative estimate. And in some areas like Ixtapalapa, half the people or more really have no access to drinking water. I saw a woman in an area called Xochimilco, which, if any of you have ever been there, you know that's an area where there are these canals, the only ones that are really left, now highly polluted and much depleted. But it's a tourist area where you can kind of go in the canals and ride in the old boats. But high up in the hills of Xochimilco is an informal settlement. So much of the city, like so many cities around the world, are now largely informal, that is slums. I met a woman named Diana Guzman and her family who lived in a tin shack without access to water, so she and the family had to essentially buy the water from men who delivered them canisters on donkeys every day. This was important because it was really about, it tells you the way in which all of these issues come down to these, it's not just about water, it's about social equity, it's about social stability. So for the Guzman family, water cost about 10% of the money they earned. It's about 10 times more expensive for them than it is for people in wealthier parts of Mexico City. So the inequity is multiplied exponentially by lack of access. This is by no means the only situation. I was just in Jakarta. Jakarta makes Mexico City look like it's, Paris. Jakarta has the effects of climate change as well. The Java Sea is rising. But the city is sinking much faster. It also is one of these exploded cities now with 30 million people living, many of them below sea level, and they have been withdrawing water out of the ground at an even faster clip. And that's because the water system that the city has had was never designed for such a large population. It has been owned by 2 private companies. They don't take care of the canals, but in addition, many of the people who've moved into the city have moved literally onto the canals. And so you have the canals in a city with no sewage system, now basically open sewers. There's no access to water otherwise, so people do what they have to. They draw it from the ground. And that means that in parts of the city, the ground is sinking a foot a year. I stood on the shore, essentially, of the Java Sea with a Dutchman who's, like all the Dutch people, there for, expertise on water. And we stood at a wall which was about waist high. It looked like it had been built in the 60s. It was actually about 3 years old. It was so badly built and so decayed. And the Java Sea was about a foot below where we were standing. And I thought, well, in a year, this ground sinks. And in fact, they're building a new barrier so high, just near where we were standing, to hold back the Java Sea, not because the sea is expected to rise 20 feet or 30 feet, but because they expect the ground to keep sinking. But the really scary part was when I turned around, he said, look back behind you at the city, at the parts of the city that were sinking, it was like standing more or less on a hilltop looking down at a valley. Essentially, the only thing holding back 40% of Jakarta from the Java Sea was this little wall, which if it were to collapse or the water were to rise a little and the city sink another foot, would simply overwhelm the city. So I wanted to put New York in context, but the last example I'll give you is I was just in Houston. So Houston is a place now, it's a blue city in a purple county in a really red state, where the Texas Republicans used to empower local governments in order to fight against federal initiatives like desegregation, gender bathrooms. Now you have a profoundly dysfunctional system compounding a cultural decentralization and an idea that of a kind of go-it-alone Texas mentality. You have a city that is almost entirely dependent on property taxes. There's no income tax. And that means it leans heavily on development. So you have had, inevitably, sprawl and lack of regulations. You have thousands of people who've lived in the reservoirs, which then had to be filled during Harvey, flooded their houses, and then had to be opened because the storm was so great. And the floodgates opened onto neighborhoods that had no idea they were even in the spillways. 200,000 homes affected by Harvey. And the damage now is somewhere around $80 billion and maybe higher. And I think the question we need to ask ourselves in all of these cases is, how do we as a society cope with problems that are so large? We tend among ourselves to talk about solutions which are manageable or seem logical, and there is a kind of checklist of things that we like to see people do. Bike lanes, restoring waterfronts and turning them into parks, and we love the Dutch for doing all of these things. These checklists of promoting mass transit and all this, these checklists are like the Transmilenio, are wonderful. But I think the scale of the problems we're facing raise other issues and raise challenges that go beyond a kind of discussion about what mayors can achieve and what communities can do on their own. And that doesn't negate any of the checklist. It is simply to say, I think we need to move on now to larger conversations about governance and about the scale of the problem. I bumped into the mayor of Mexico City in Quito during the Habitat Conference, UN Habitat Conference. And I asked him how things were going, and he said that the federal government in Mexico had cut to zero funding for Mexico City initiatives like improving the water system and creating parks and all the other initiatives that he was coming up with. And that's because he had been thinking about running for president, and the current administration didn't want to do anything for Mexico City that would help him out. He had hopes that he could get back most of that money, or at least some of it. But I think we do have to face questions about governance, and we have to ask big questions about how we as a society want to deal with those sorts of challenges. And I'm not quite sure, especially in today's America, that those challenges are not as extreme as they sound in a place like Mexico or Indonesia. I'm hoping that as we talk about this today and talk about what's happened with Sandy and talk about this in a community level as well, we can also ask ourselves questions about how we as a society set priorities and kind of create an agenda for ourselves that aspires to do what we did when we created the grid. I'll end with the Dutch just by saying, I remember going to visit a place called the Overdiepse Polder in the Netherlands. And why it was really interesting to me of all the projects there was because you had about 16 farmers who had been living in this particular polder. And as part of the Dutch sort of strategy for how to let in the water, which we will all learn to do, or would need to do, they had designated areas that would have to become spillways, that would have to be flooded, determined by the science of where the water would rise, what climate change might do, and what their priorities were as a nation. So this particular polder was used to protect Den Bosch, a city of about 450,000 that was just upriver. And in order to, they calculated, the Dutch, that for a 1 in 25-year flood, which is quite frequent, that this polder would have to be flooded. It would have to become a spillway. So the farmers were simply told, you can't be here anymore. This was really interesting to me because it reflected a national consensus that the Dutch had only reached, let us remember, after repeated calamities had caused them finally to accept the idea that half measures would no longer do. The interesting thing about it was that the farmers, of course, resisted, as they would here or anywhere else, but the government was very clear, and the issues of science and water were the dominant narrative. And so in the end, a compromise was worked out that allowed the polder to be used as a spillway, and for a number of the farmers who really wanted to stay, to, instead of taking the money to be moved, to take that money and construct essentially mounds where their farms could be built within the polder, about 7 of them. And so their cows could graze in the polder, but when a flood was happening, the cows would come up onto the farms, up the hill, and the polder would still function sufficiently as a spillway. It's just a reminder, I think, that sometimes hard decisions have to be made. We have to deal with science and the reality of the world that we have created. And the politics of doing this is really where the rubber hits the road.